Louise, welcome back. Thanks
Thanks
so
for
much for
having me.
coming back after your um, excellent performance the first time on the problem of evil. So you need no introduction. Obviously, you're from UMass Amherst. We could have had you back for the philosophy of mind segment, since you're a noted philosopher of mind, but you're also a distinguished feminist philosopher. So I thought I would get um, hear from you on the thorny topics of race and gender. Okay, so I know you have a number of interesting views on these matters. So let me start with a question that takes us back to earlier in the course when we were talking about knowledge and Timothy Williamson, and in particular, the apparent failure to define knowledge, to give non-trivial, necessary, and sufficient conditions for someone to know something. And there is something of a parallel here in feminist philosophy, starting maybe around the 1980s. Feminist philosophers began to be seriously worried that they couldn't say what women were. The category of woman couldn't be analyzed or defined. And how can feminism even get off the ground if we can't define its subject matter? So you recently wrote a paper about this, and you agree that the question, what is a woman, has no, understood as a request for necessary and sufficient conditions, or for non-trivial necessary and sufficient conditions, has no answer, but you think that this is nothing to worry about. So could you say something about, first, why feminists thought this apparent lack of definability was a big problem, and second, why you think it isn't?
So I'm not sure that in the 80s we were so worried about the lack of a definition for the term woman or the lack of a analysis for the concept woman. I think the concern was rather what generalizations were true of women that held across cultures and across times. There's a great deal, there were, as you know, there were several strains of feminism that were being promoted at the time. I happened to be most interested in what's now called socialist feminism, so feminism that had, well, as I think of it, a liberal theory of the person. And then a socialist analysis of political structures and economic structures within which um, persons live, and of course are affected by those structures. Um, and I also I spent my first 2 years of graduate school attending weekly meetings of the Boston Socialist Feminist Union, and the big controversy was between the Marxist feminists and the socialist feminists, and the big controversy was, did sexist oppression begin with property, as Marx and Engels had speculated it did, or was sexist oppression something that needed to be understood sort of along a separate parameter from economic oppression? And what seemed to me at the time, and still seems to me to be true, is the second view, that sexist oppression is just a different parameter when you're looking at the total sum of a person's social position. But so there, the contrast was with liberal feminism, and that would be Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem. And these were women who were, rightly or wrongly, taken by many of us to be canonizing, making canonical, or the main thing, the position of affluent, well-educated white heterosexual women. Black feminists were pointing out that things that were regarded as norms of femininity, like timidity, deference, if you looked at the way Black women were expected to behave, that was quite different. So Black women were oppressed partly by the expectation that they were sexually available. Um, and you see that very clearly with norms for masculinity. So if a white man is supposed to be assertive and confident and strong, those are not characteristics that are prized by racist society in a black man. Black man is much more apt to be punished for those things than for those characteristics than rewarded. So that issue was named by Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black legal theorist um, and lawyer, who called it intersectionality. So you have intersecting vectors that can produce a space that is different from the space that is produced by the interaction of other vectors like whiteness and affluence and gender. So I think that that, and then also the protests and work by women in developing countries made it clear that it was going to be very, very hard to say anything along the lines that Betty Friedan was saying in her book, The Feminine Mystique, about what she called the problem that has no name, which was essentially, this is to trivialize it unfairly, but it was essentially the problem of boredom among affluent white women who had educations but were expected to play the role of housewife. So I think it was more a question of what can we say about women in general that will be true or close enough to true to be serviceable for political action, and how can we promote solidarity among women if we recognize all of these splintering factors that can affect the condition that women find themselves in. I think there are some generalizations about women that can be made, but I think that was the main concern, was that there might not be enough of them, or there might be. I think Western white feminists in particular were became very aware of the danger of generalizing from their own experience to the experience of women. But in general, I don't think we need definitions of kinds in order to investigate them, study them, learn about them. We've investigated natural kinds for centuries without necessarily having a definition. I mean, we've got chemical definitions of some physical kinds, but biological kinds. I think what we've learned as science progresses is that there really is gradation across species more than sharp divisions, and yet we can meaningfully talk about dogs. There can be veterinarians and so forth.
So some feminist philosophers, though, have invested a lot of time in trying to essentially give necessary and sufficient conditions for what it is to be a woman. And I think it's fair to say that at least some of them seem to have been somewhat alarmed by the apparent failure of these accounts. So your position is, in a way, somewhat analogous to Williamson's position in epistemology, that feminists should just take the term woman as a primitive, not having a definition and not needing one. So in the case of Williamson, of course, he tells us a lot about what knowledge is without pretending to define it. He thinks that it entails truth and entails belief, for one thing. So it's not that you think we can't say anything about women in that sense. So what sort of category is the category woman, on your view?
So I think woman is a social kind. You and I disagree about this. My account of the well, first of all, in general, social kinds, for me, social kind is a kind of misnomer. I think of kinds in general as being, what Richard Boyd called homeostatic property clusters. So they are they're groups of individuals that share a lot of properties for a principled reason, and there are mechanisms that keep the constituting properties more or less in phase with each other. In the case of what we think of as natural kinds, it's laws of nature, or laws of the particular level of or order of characterization that you're dealing with. So biological laws keep biological kinds more or less, the properties of the kinds more or less in phase with each other. But I think of what most people call social kinds in terms of the kinds of mechanisms that keep the properties that are true of the members of the kind, keep them in phase. And in the case of what I like to think of as intentional kinds or artifactual kinds, it's the representations of human beings. It's our intentional states, our mental states, our ways of thinking of things that keep them in phase. And in Ron Mallon has really spelled this view out in detail in a book that I admire tremendously, The Construction of Human Kinds. And that's the picture that I have. And I think that what we've got in the case of, I think gender and race are both social kinds. I think they differ in the story about what keeps the properties of the members sort of in phase with each other. But in both cases, I think there is, well, in the case of gender, I want to say that there is a material ground for gender systems. The material ground is sexual dimorphism in human beings. I'm very aware of the existence of intersex individuals. I'm very aware of the existence of trans women and trans men. I want to affirm that trans women are women and that trans men are men. There are binary individuals who do not identify as either men or women, and I respect those identifications as well. I think they're there. It's not for me to respect them or not. I acknowledge them. But I do think that, and I think that all of those people in all those categories can be oppressed by the existence of a gender system. So what I think is going on is that sexual dimorphism among human beings, because of its role in reproduction and because of the centrality of reproduction to all human societies, it provides an explanation for why social kinds would be developed and elaborated on the basis of sexual difference. That's not to say that in order to be a woman, you have to be a prototypical female person, but it is to say that the existence of a social role of woman depends upon there being this sexual dimorphism among human beings. Now, I think what happens in society is that once these gender systems arise, gender as category, man and woman as categories, work to bring more and more properties into phase or into concordance with each other that there's no natural or logical reason to keep in phase. I mean, there's absolutely no reason why enjoying, participating in, or watching sports should be concordant with disdaining the color pink. But I submit that those things are very concordant in contemporary American society. And of course, there are more serious things too. So, I think it's not mysterious why taking care of children should be part of the gender role of woman in every human society that I know about. But it's not required. I know you take care of your child, and my husband took care of our children and still takes care of them. You have to keep taking care of them even after they're 30. Just to let you know that.
I'm putting Griffin to work, though. He's appeared.
Okay. Well, then that's good. Yeah. So I think that it's clear, particularly with advances in technology that make it physically possible, biologically possible for people other than women to take care of children. That people should feel free and be free to choose their involvement in those roles without social pressure, social approbation if they do the wrong thing. According to the norms, norms are very important in disciplining people into gender roles. So that's how I think of it. I think the material ground for racial difference is very different. The material ground, I think, is material domination. So here I follow Catherine McKinnon and Noam Chomsky, and I think I might be the only person in the world to express that confluence to call attention to that confluence of belief. But they both believe, with respect to race, as McKinnon puts it, that difference follows dominance. That the sort of genetic story is sorry, I mean genetic in the sense of origin story, not biologically genetic, is that you have one group of people who are manage to dominate another group of people, and then differences, which might be real. I mean, there might be differences in skin color. There might not be. I mean, the Irish and the English, apparently, the English thought of the Irish for a long time, maybe still do, um, as a different race, but they're genetically virtually indistinguishable, I understand. But you have a group that comes to dominate materially another group, and they seize on differences to construct a sort of ideological story about why the domination is justified, why it's okay, why these people are deserve to be in a subordinate position. So that's what I think the story about race is, and I think that race is therefore kind of more optional than gender is. I don't think it has the kind of deep roots in fundamental human difference that I think gender does have. I don't know.
Okay, and by, just to be clear, by gender, let's see, a somewhat slippery word used in many different ways. Here we're just talking about the categories of man, woman, and other similar categories. So in that paper where you defend the view that the category woman is not analyzable, you say that if we didn't live in a society with each other, there would be no gender.
Well, again, one of the reasons that I like to make a distinction between artifactual or intentional
Yeah.
kinds and social kinds is that I don't think that artifactual kinds have to involve social cooperation. I think in the case of gender, um, uh, yeah, I mean, if
Some
we,
sort of society is necessary, just as some
yes,
sort of
yes,
society is
yes,
necessary in order for someone to be a queen or a police officer.
yes.
Okay, but then and then similarly with race, if we didn't live in society with each other, there would be no race. So what about the thought, which certainly some people find appealing, that, well, we could abolish society, or perhaps for present purposes this is equivalent, we could just completely ignore biological sex, not view it as socially significant at all anymore. To borrow an analogy of yours, then we regard eye color as socially significant. And then similarly for race, we could dream of a society in which people's skin color and ancient ancestry is of no importance whatsoever. But in those counterfactual scenarios, there would still be men and women, and there would still be black people and white people and Asian people. So isn't that something that you have to deny, given that you think that race, gender are social kinds?
No, I don't think so. I mean, race is very complicated, it turns out, and I totally defer to the experts, one of whom I regard Spencer, Quayshawn Spencer, is an expert. Um, but there are a number of people. Michael Hardiman is taking the same line that Spencer is taking. Robin Andreasen has been arguing for this for a long time. That at least the racial categories that are familiar to us in the United States do track lineages, and there are lineages. But look, there are lineages that matter and lineages that don't matter. My husband Joe's lineage comes from Poland. My lineage comes from the British Isles. Great Britain. I might have some Irish ancestry. The problem is that, as far as I can make out from Ancestry, Wikipedia.com, about 3/4 of the people who have ever lived in England and Ireland have one of the two names in my family. So it's very hard to figure out where exactly I came from and when. But and then I have German ancestry that I've been a little more successful in tracking down. But those lineages don't seem to matter now. They create physical differences. I mean, Joe especially when we were younger, Joe looks very different from the way I look, and many people can identify Jewish people by sight. On the other hand, if you look in Israel, you've got you've got Jews that are come from Ethiopia and have virtually black skin, and you have Jews that come from Eastern Europe that tend to have dark hair, but some, like Joe, have blonde hair. So I think, probably within racial categories that are recognized um, uh, by some particular society, you probably have a genuine family resemblance among the members of those races. But there are physical differences, but that doesn't mean that we have to assign social significance to the physical differences. I think gender is different. I think reproduction is. I mean, it's significant. I don't see people simply ignoring those differences. And I don't advocate that. What I advocate for is, well, first pass, stop working so hard to elaborate them by adding irrelevant markers. I mean, when my daughter was in elementary school, her school choir had a dress code that said girls wear red dresses and boys wear white shirts and black pants. I mean, why do that? So get rid of the irrelevant marking. And then there are deeper things. I mean, I think Catherine McKinnon thinks that sexual subordination is sort of the key to the construction of gender. I think it's. I think there are two different messages that are projected very powerfully to little girls and little boys, and one is the one that's projected to little girls is, you're here for the sake of other people. And I think they get that message in lots and lots of ways, and I think it's destructive. And then boys get the message that they are not, their interests are the primary interests. I mean, it's an empirical question. That's my surmise, and I think those are very difficult. I think those are terrible messages to send. I think every child should be encouraged to respect and pursue their own interests and their own talents. And I think that every child should be encouraged to be attentive to the needs of others and to be prepared to contribute to the well-being of others and to the social good. So that's one of the ways in which I think we could make a change, even though we would have to, biology is there, you can't deny it.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Can I come back to that in 1 second? But let me just briefly follow up on the claim that gender and race are social kinds. So one advantage of a view like Spencer's, or arguably one advantage of a view like Spencer's, is that it does allow the possibility that we could become completely colorblind and not invest race with any social significance at all. And yet this wouldn't amount to abolishing race. People would still be as raced as they were before. There would still be Asians and Pacific Islanders and Native Americans. But I thought that on your view, being raced, or being black or being white, is more akin to, say, being a slave. Once we've got rid of slavery, then there just aren't any slaves anymore. It's not that the slaves are still around, but we don't treat them badly. There just aren't any slaves. And then similarly, if we invest no social significance in sex or morphological features, ancient ancestry, then there wouldn't be any men or women or blacks or whites.
Well, I don't want to say about well, look, race is. I mean, as I remember Spencer's work, he starts with the Bureau of Census, U.S. Bureau of Census racial categories.
Yeah, the Office of Management and Budget.
That's it. Thank you. Yeah, I can. And he analyzes data that these massive databases that look at people's DNA and can find markers of lineage that you can analyze as I understand it, you can analyze the data in a variety of ways. But if you say to the algorithm, take this data and organize it into 5 groups that are similar to each other and more similar than the others, right. It can be done in those 5 groups. I mean, you can do it into 7 or 9 groups or 2 groups too. But there's a kind of naturalness to the 5 group way of analyzing things. And what you find is that there are genetic markers, and as I understand it, they have to be non-functional DNA, right? So they're not genetic markers. They're not genes that correspond to the phenotypic differences that we use observation.
Oh, right. Yeah. That's how those programs work.
Right.
They just look at genomic variants in non-coding bits of DNA.
Right. But that's important because what really is getting tracked is we're not getting the sort of an essential basis for the properties that we use to classify people. We're getting marks of lineage. Now, one way that race could go away is if there's massive intermarriage among people from different groups. And, to some extent that's happening. Like, I mean, African Americans in the United States, part of the, the terrible blight of slavery and to the lasting shame of my ancestors, quite a few African Americans, maybe most of them, have a great deal of European ancestry as well. Right. But it's been a social practice that regards anyone who has any African lineage as Black. So I'm not an advocate of the elimination of race. I wouldn't. I'm also deeply libertarian in the sense that I think that you ought not to interfere with people's free choices if you can, unless they're doing something that is harmful and hurtful to others. And I think that racial segregation is certainly something that has to be eliminated. But I don't think that we need to take steps to ensure that people don't gather together in groups that are racially homogenous or do anything like that. I think that if the rest of society is improved in ways that it should be just on general moral grounds, I predict that that racial difference will begin to erode. And I think that gender will become less and less significant. As I say, the biology is going to stay there. I don't want to strive for there to be artificial wombs and so forth, but already we've got reproductive technology that enables 2 gay men to have children that they have biological relationships with. So, I think that we're going to find, and I think we are finding, at least in some subcultures, that gender, the social category, is becoming less and less important, less and less significant, even as, we deal creatively.
Well, there has been a proliferation of genders recently. So which might...
Yeah, you want to call it. I mean,
well, okay. Well, can I just throw a quote back at you from a paper of yours that you a much older paper.
Yes.
It was written in 1998. So, and in that paper you wrote, we should strive for a society in which biological sex has as little systematic social significance as eye color. And that does seem to be, as I understand it, I mean, extremely radical thought. So could you just sort of elaborate on that? I mean, some people, of course, might think it's
Yes.
completely infeasible or totally undesirable, or both. So
I was actually yeah, I'll defend that now. Um, uh, what I mean is that, if you have a person who is going to begin menstruating when she's 11, um, that's as may be. But one doesn't have to build a hut for her in the backyard and insist that she be there during the period when she's menstruating. Um, if there are children whose voices are going to differ in the octaves they can sing as they get older, that's fine, but you don't really have to sort people. I mean, sort people into vocal types, but you don't need to do it by sex. I know quite a few women. I've sung in an all-women's chorus. I know quite a few women whose vocal range lies squarely in the tenor part. And in other choruses, they're forced to sing alto parts that are actually uncomfortably high for them. So we just don't need to add anything to what the biological differences entail. And I say this with the understanding that there is no direct entailment from biology to anything social or even phenotypical. That when we understand mechanisms, we can make changes. But we just don't have to. We just don't have to do anything. I mean, I don't know what would happen to patterns of sexual attraction if we didn't insist on what Marilyn Frye calls gender marking. Um, she points out that, and many feminist writers have made this point too. We send kids a very powerful message that it's important that everybody be identifiable as a boy or a girl, a man or a woman. And then we institute taboos against displaying the physiological basis that's supposed to be at the root of all of this. So there are a lot of stories that I don't know if we have time for this, but there's a
sure, yeah.
so Sandra Bem is a psychologist who tells a story. I think it may be cited by Cordelia Fine um, in her book on gender. But when Sandra Bem and her then husband had a child, it was a boy, and they decided they would be strictly gender neutral in the way they raised him. And so he could wear anything he wanted. And one of the things he liked to wear was barrettes. Which I don't know if your students will know what barrettes are, but
I barely know what barrettes are.
They're clips. And back in those days, which was, I think, probably in the 60s, in the United States, they were girl things. They were definitely girl things, and they would often be in pastel colors, light blue or pink or lavender. They'd often be decorated with bows or butterflies or birds, things like that. But their son liked to wear them. And when he went off to school, they wanted to prepare him for the likely reaction he would get from other kids. And they sort of drilled him on what to say if somebody called him a girl. He was to say, no, I'm a boy, I have a penis, boys have penises, girls have vaginas. So he gets to school, and predictably, other boys start saying, oh, you're a girl, you wear barrettes. And he would patiently repeat that, no, he was a boy, he had a penis, etc. And so they kept it up. Finally, the little boy, in exasperation, drops his pants. But that's not the punchline. The other boys look at him and say, everybody's got one of those, but only girls wear barrettes. So little kids can be very unclear about what the basis of this difference is, and they can sort of seize on different observable, patterns as the basis of this. So I think that I think the necessity of gender marking, at least again, as I said, in some subcultures, I think the necessity of gender marking is going away. And without gender marking, it's not always obvious whether you're dealing with a creature with a penis or a creature with a vagina or a creature with an assortment of things. And when you can't identify a person in a gendered way, you can't respond. You don't respond to them in a gendered way. So that's what I'm looking for, is a proliferation of all sorts of differences that are not predictably associated with each other when there's no reason for them to be associated with each other.
Of course, children themselves are the world's worst gender police. You know, they do tend to
Right.
segregate themselves into gendered groups from a
Yeah.
very early age. And
And
that
yes,
doesn't
and
seem to have much to do with parental influence.
well, I've heard a lot of parents say, we worked very, very hard not to make any distinction between boys and girls, but little Tommy wants to play with trucks and little Susie wants to play with dolls. I think parents are deluding themselves if they think that they've got a large share of control over the messages that kids get. I mean, unless they live, on a mountaintop with no television or internet access. It's just out there in the air that this is a very, very important difference. But my son and daughter both had playmates of both sexes. Now, again, that's reflective of the social milieus in which they grew up, which were always academic communities. But they're not. I just don't see this rigidity. I mean, I see it sometimes, but I also see an awful lot of gender anxiety among parents, even ones that say that they are committed to gender equality. And I think probably the boys bear the brunt of it. I think there's more latitude for girls when they're young to do boy stuff than there is
Oh,
for
sure,
boys to
yes.
do
I
girl
mean,
stuff.
yes, it's easier being a tomboy than being a sissy.
I mean, it is to a point. It is to a point. If a girl goes into middle school and she's still not combing her hair and she doesn't want to wear dresses and she's interested in sports, now the homophobia is going to set in,
Right.
and she's going to be in for a hard time.
Right. Okay, Louise, I shouldn't take up any more of your time. That was terrific. Thank you so much for coming on
Can I
for a second time.
can I
Yes,
just say one more thing about
please.
defining woman and man? I do think that I do object to the focus that there's been on analyzing the concept of woman or giving a definition of the term woman, because I think what we want to be doing is characterizing women and the condition of women. And but I think those characterizations should be empirical. I mean, I think with respect to, I know you're going to do Haslinger soon. With respect to Haslinger's definition, I think that it is.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, let's carry on. So,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
tell me. Okay. So
Sorry, sorry, sorry.
tell me about Sally's definition.
Well, so Sally wants to make. She thinks there are three kinds of projects you can have, and the one that she calls the ameliorative project, or what she called in earlier work the analytic project, involves characterizing the gender of being a woman as being essentially tied to being subordinated. And I think that this is inspired by McKinnon's characterization of woman as being sexually subordinated. But I don't think that it's, and Haslinger wants to argue that this is a more politically useful way to think of women than a way that doesn't include that component. But I think just the reverse. I think that we don't want it to be analytic that women are subordinated, because it's something people can disagree about and I think be informed about. So I think it's at least maybe I shouldn't say contingent. It might be, I don't know. I don't like to do metaphysics. It's at least an a priori conclusion that women are subordinated. I don't think that everybody who is competent in the use of the term women, or everyone who has the concept women, is committed to women being subordinated. So that's one of the reasons that I like to strip the concepts and the terms down to virtually nothing, because then I think that the generalizations that you make that hold can be a posteriori, can be empirical, can be informative. That's all I was going to say.
Okay, all right. One last question, if I may, since you insisted on plunging ahead. So feminists, at the very least, are in the business of improving the lives of women. They want to do something. They want to improve the female literacy rate or prevent rape or whatever it might be. But of course, there is this branch of philosophy in which you're a distinguished figure called feminist philosophy. And philosophers typically don't do very much other than produce books and papers that perhaps relatively few people read. So what can philosophy contribute to the feminist project exactly?
All right, I'm going to bring up Chomsky again. As you and all your students, I'm sure, know, he is not only the Albert Einstein of cognitive science as a linguist, but he is an extraordinary actor in U.S. progressive politics and has been a longstanding critic of U.S. foreign policy and economic organization. And I've attended in my day many talks that he's given, both in linguistics and in politics. And at the political talk, almost without exception in every talk, someone will ask from the audience, what do your views in linguistics have to do with your views in politics? And I remember him once giving an answer that I really liked. He said, I don't understand. Your question has a presupposition. It's that people can't be interested in more than one thing. So there are issues in feminist theory that I find intellectually interesting. And that, for me, is sufficient for me to be interested in them as a philosopher. I hope that I'm contributing to the political projects of feminism, but I do think my duties as a feminist, my political duties as a feminist, are somewhat independent of my my work as a philosopher. My own work in feminist theory up until now has been largely focused on ways in which appeals to nature and the natural are mistaken or misused. And, you know, I hope that I teach that in my own feminism class. Because I think understanding properly the relationship between genes and phenotypes is important for a lot of reasons, not least of which is an understanding of the relationship between men and women. And I'm also interested in the general issue of equality, the paper that you mentioned earlier, Back to Androgyny. I wrote with an excellent paper by Richard Wasserstrom in mind, where he says, among other things, okay, so let's suppose we're committed to equality. What exactly does equality entail? And he gives us at least 3 different kinds of equality that we might hold as ideals in a society. One of them is what he calls the assimilationist ideal. That's the one that I endorsed. I don't like the term, but it's basically you make, I mean, this is his phrase actually, you make sexual differences socially insignificant as eye color. But he allows that there might be other conceptions of equality, a difference conception, and such a conception has been argued for by many feminist theorists. Sarah Ruddick and others have argued that the problem is not that there are 2 different gender roles. The problem is that the feminine gender role has been devalued. So what we need to do, no reason to think that women should be discouraged from or that there should be any criticism of women devoting themselves to the care of children or the care of the home. We just need to properly value that work. So I think there's some interesting issues in political issues. I'm also interested in freedom of speech, um, so-called cancel culture, claims that some feminist theorists are making that women in certain circumstances are being silenced. I'm interested in all of those issues that interact with the philosophy of language. And one of the reasons that I got drawn into this question about what a woman is that I have this, I think it's probably a fringe view that almost all concepts are primitive and unanalyzable, and almost all words are semantically simple.
That is the influence of Jerry Fodor, presumably, in your
Oh, yes,
student
a little
days.
bit, just a little
Yes,
bit.
yes,
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm very influenced by
yeah,
Fodor in the philosophy of mind and language. So, insofar as I saw those issues getting raised and implicated, I got drawn in.
yes, exactly. Very good, Louise.
I'll let you
Thank
go
you,
now,
thank
Albert.
you, thank you again.
My pleasure, genuinely.